Hi everyone. Okay, moving on. I just recorded the genetics one, so now we're going to move on to human variation. So kind of still in the zone. Some of these topics are connected. So let me just pull up my PowerPoint. Okay, so like before, you guys know you can pull me up side by side, however you want to do it. If you want to just hear my voice and watch the PowerPoint, if you want to look at the PowerPoint later. Some of these that make sense to do, some of them you might want to watch them side by side, it just depends. Also, I want to say, like I think I mentioned this in like one of the first PowerPoints, or I'm sorry, one of the first video recorded lectures, that when we're in the lab, I want to dedicate that to actual lab time. However, with a couple of these, I might spend a tiny bit of time in class kind of repeating something I said in one of these videos. Like for example, right now we're going to talk about pedigree charts. I'm going to use my whiteboard again. I'm going to do a little pedigree. I might give another example in class just to make sure we're all on the same page. So if you're thinking, oh, I'm following along, but I have a couple questions, but we're going to just jump right into the book or something, trust me, a couple of these I will at least give maybe like one more example. But the nice thing is with these you can like record and pause and stuff like that. But I will spend probably a little bit of time every day we're in lab kind of asking if anyone needs clarity, or I might just pick a topic and just kind of maybe rewrite something on the board just so we're all clear, right? Because I understand, with these recorded lectures, you don't have the ability to say, oh, I have a question, so I'll definitely keep some time, ideally at the beginning of class. But like I said before, we are cramming so much in. In fact, I am astounded that, because I've taught summer courses before, I've taught condensed courses, but I've never taught a 4-week. I think the most I did before was the lowest I did was a 5-week, but we were in the lab together like 3 days a week. So this is a little bit different. It's kind of similar, but it's kind of different, So the way I'm going to set up the labs, the way I'm going to give exams is going to be much different, and to let you guys know, to your advantage. I'm not trying to like fail everyone or something, right? So we're gonna do this all together. You guys are gonna learn something. We're gonna make it work for everyone. Okay. Anyway. Okay, so now moving on to the PowerPoint for today, human variation. So first slide, we're jumping right into pedigree analysis, like I mentioned. So pedigree analysis, probably going to use the board in a minute, but you can see here the image on the first bullet point is kind of showing like shapes like squares and circles and some lines. Basically what this is showing is like one generation to another generation to another generation. Now this could be frogs, rabbits, beetles, whatever. We're going to talk about humans today, right? But it's really just mapping families from a biological stance. So if you had maybe done something similar to this in maybe like the cultural course, you probably put a lot more details in about maybe some cultural, socio-cultural relationships or something like that. This is more looking at just biological stuff, so similar, but different. So the next slide, you'll see there are a couple of rules about how this is done. So males, we use squares, females, we use circles. The lines, whether it's horizontal or vertical, would represent, like either a sexual mating or, like offspring if it's, like a vertical line. And as I walk you through a couple of these, you'll be like, oh, I can see how this makes sense, right? I think these are pretty logical, but I'll definitely walk you through. Okay, so the next slide, you'll see practice pedigree number 1. So we're jumping right in. And I think I have 3 of these on this PowerPoint. Let's see how well I do with the first one, doing it like this with you guys, and decide if we're going to do maybe 1 or 2 or all 3 or, something like that. Okay, let's get out a pen. I got some different ones. I got some tinier ones, so hopefully these are a little better. Hopefully the glare. I need enough sunlight in here so you can see my face, but I'm trying not to have there be a lot of glare. So we're gonna make this work, right? Okay. So if you're following along, you're gonna see practice pedigree number 1. First bullet point. Mike and Jennifer are in a sexual relationship. Now I could have said Mike and Jennifer are married, but whether they're married or not isn't important because you can still have offspring, right, if you're not married, so it doesn't matter. So Mike and Jennifer are in a sexual relationship. Okay, we've got 2 people. We can start out with them at the top. So we're going to do, remember males are square, so we would say Mike, and then Jennifer. I just thought of, it's like backwards. It flips. This makes me sound like an idiot that I don't know that. Well, we're gonna just run with it. You guys can still follow along. It's fine. We'll figure it out. Okay. let's see. Okay, so the next thing, they have 2 children, Marianne, a female, and then Ryan, a male. So we can do a little drop down to indicate we're going to do like their offspring. And we're going to do, let's see, the female is Marianne. We'll just put an M. We don't have to write the whole name. And then we'll do Ryan with an R. Okay. So now we have this family, right? Parents and 2 offspring. Hopefully this makes sense to everyone so far. Okay, remember males are square, females are circle. The next bullet point, Ryan has 1 son with a female. Okay. Now we don't have her name, but we know she's a circle, so that's fine. And we know there's a son, so we can drop down here. Okay, it doesn't say the son's name or the female's name. That's fine. We can still use the shape. That's totally fine. And then for clarity, Marianne has no offspring. So that's it. So this is the chart so far. So we haven't really had to figure anything out yet. We've just kind of drawn the shapes according to what the problem has told us, right? So now the last few bullet points, it's gonna ask us to kind of figure some stuff out. So the first thing is, it says Jennifer is affected by the dominant trait. The dominant trait. Hold on one second. Let me just look at something real quick before I move on. Oh, okay. That makes sense. Now remember, we had talked about like dominant versus recessive before, right? So keeping those concepts in mind. And it also is important to remember when it says whether it's dominant or recessive, because whether it's dominant or recessive will sometimes alter how we answer some of the questions. So I would say making a little note to yourself, like, oh, this is a dominant trait, kind of at the beginning, you'll be like, oh, I need to remember that to answer some of these follow-up questions accurately. Okay. So Jennifer is affected by the dominant trait. So when it says they're affected, it's meaning she phenotypically on her outside is showing this trait, whatever the trait is. You know, it could be cleft chin or dimple or something. She has it. Jennifer does. And when an individual has that particular trait, we're going to shade in, you know, just a little like that, shade in their trait, or shade in their shape, I'm sorry. Then it says, so are Ryan and his son, so we can shade in Ryan and the son. Okay. And then just for clarity, it says no other family member is affected. So now we've shaded everyone in that we need to. And then the last bullet point, and really the main question for this, is what are the genotypes for each individual? Remember, for genotypes, we're talking about either homozygous dominant, heterozygous, or homozygous recessive. Now I'm using the letter A. Like I said, I don't care what letter you use as long as the uppercase and lowercase look different. That's the only important part. So there's no confusion on your part or on mine. So now we have to basically label every individual with one of these 3. Now, because we know it's a dominant trait, let's see if who's shaded or who isn't shaded. Let's see if that's gonna like help us determine that. So first, let's look at it this way. If you have a dominant trait and you're going to show it phenotypically, thinking of those rules of like dominant versus recessive, you could either be homozygous dominant, or you could also be heterozygous, right? Because then this dominant allele would mask the recessive. So on your outside, in your phenotype, you would still express that trait. So for those who are not affected, there's only one option that they can be, and that is that they are homozygous recessive, right? Either of the other 2, whether you only have the dominant trait or whether you only have one, you will still show that dominant trait on your actual body. The only way you wouldn't express it on your actual body is if you were this last one, homozygous recessive. So we already know that these 3 individuals, because we already know they don't show the trait at all, that those 3 individuals are homozygous recessive, and we can kind of label them and put a little circle around it. So those 3 individuals we've figured out already, they are homozygous recessive. And then the other 3, we have to determine between these 2, are they homozygous dominant or heterozygous, right? So let's look at top with Jennifer. We know Mike, her partner, and we know at least one of the we know at least one of the offspring, right? Maybe that'll help guide us a little bit. So let's say we weren't sure yet, and we didn't see any of this other info. We were just looking at Jennifer. Let's say, okay, I'm not sure. Is it homozygous dominant, or is it heterozygous? like which one, right? So maybe we can kind of use this as a guide, like, okay, the one offspring we know, Marianne, she is homozygous recessive, so she's getting one little A or one recessive allele from dad. That works, right? Which means she has to get the other little A from mom. So mom would have to be heterozygous, right? If mom were homozygous dominant, she would show the trait, but there's no way, she'd have to be able to give a little A to Marianne and she wouldn't have one. So she has to be heterozygous, right? And kind of using that same idea, we can fill in the rest of this too. So Ryan, we're like, okay, we know, actually let's do the son first, right? So we've got the son. Once again, if we didn't see any of this other info and all we knew was that it was a dominant trait and he was shaded, we would know he's either of these two, homozygous dominant or possibly heterozygous. But looking at his mom, we can already eliminate that he's homozygous dominant, right? He could get a big A from dad. We haven't done dad yet, but we already have done mom, and mom only has little A, so he has to be able to get a little A from mom. And if he's heterozygous, he would have that, which means he's going to get the big A from dad, right? So let's see if we can figure out dad. Now we got Ryan's son and Ryan's parents. So now hopefully we can figure out Ryan. So once again, let's say we didn't know and we thought, okay, Ryan could be homozygous dominant or he could be heterozygous. Is there a way we can narrow this down? Let's look at the parents first, right? Homozygous dominant, he'd have to get a big A from mom and a big A from dad. Look, okay, he could get a big A from mom, that would work, but he can't get a big A from dad. Dad only has little A's to give. You're kind of solving a puzzle right now, right? So we would say he can't be homozygous dominant. If he were heterozygous, this would work because he's getting a little A from dad and a big A from mom, and this would also work with the offspring. We know about his son because son needs one little A, getting that from mom because that's all mom has, and getting the big A from dad, which he has if he's heterozygous. So kind of a lot going on here, right? But as long as you remember those rules and you kind of double check what you're doing along the way, and you do a few of these, this will make sense. So we will definitely be doing one of these on the exam, but like I said, don't stress about the exams and stuff. Like, I'm not sure how much you've watched of these yet or how much I've talked about in class and stuff yet, but I'm going to make sure everyone does well in this class, right? I'm going to challenge you, but we're going to be working to a successful goal for everyone. Okay. So I think we segue right into another one of these. Let's see. Let me see how many I have actually. Oh, there's only 2. Okay, so we'll do the second one. Let me just clear my whiteboard. Now the nice thing is you can rewind, you can pause. If I'm moving a little quickly, you can just, I did all that in 4 minutes. You could just watch it a few times and then be able to understand it. So pros and cons with taking a class in class or not, Okay, let's pick a different color for fun. I got a green. Let's see. Actually, let's use blue so it's nice and dark. Okay. So the second, it says practice pedigree number 2. Okay. We've got Jake and Judy. Once again, Jake and Judy are in a relationship. I'm trying to make this wiggle so much, but it's hard. I'm trying to do a million things at once. So we're going to make this work. Okay. We got Jake and Judy. Let's draw them. So we've got Jake. Remember, he's a square. I'll write him down here. And then Judy, we're going to use a circle for Judy. They have 3 offspring, Marissa, Charlie, and Anne. So I'll let's see, Marissa, Charlie, and Anne. And it also says M or F, depending, because you might have a name like Charlie that could, go either way. So I have M or F, so it's clear which one I'm talking about. And Marissa and Anne are female, and Charlie is a male. Then it says Anne has a son with a male. Oh, I forgot to label these people. Marissa, Anne, and Charlie. That's fine. So the next bullet point, Anne has 1 son. So there's a male. We don't know his name, right? But there is a male. And I'm trying to get that glare out. There is a son, right? So we don't know their name, so we can still draw their shapes. Don't forget to draw the other person. Sometimes they'll be like, oh, this person had a son. Well, did she do it was it a miracle? There has to be someone else involved, right? For clarity, Charlie has no offspring, so we can just leave Charlie alone. And then Marissa has 2 daughters. So once again, there is definitely a male in here. And then it says, what was it, 2 daughters? 2 daughters. Try to keep some of these generations even, for the most part. Let's see, because that's kind of more dead on. Okay. Try to balance it on My chair. Okay. And then moving on to that second set of bullet points. So it says Judy is affected by the recessive trait. Recessive trait. This is important. Like I said before, if it's a dominant trait or recessive trait, this is going to drastically change how you label or how you shade people in and how you answer those questions. So recessive trait, make a note of that. Don't forget that part, right? Recessive trait. Oh my God, I'm really trying to get that glare off for you guys. Okay. Let's see, next part. Oh, so I'm sorry, Judy is affected. So we're going to shade in Judy, shade her in, right? Shade her in. So our Charlie, let's shade Charlie. Marissa, we'll shade in Marissa. One of Marissa's daughters, we'll just pick one, just pick, whichever one you want. One of those circles, shade it in. And Anne. So a handful of people in this family are affected. So phenotypically are showing the recessive, whatever this recessive trait is, right? And then for clarity, no other family member is affected, and now we're just left with that last bullet point. So the first of it is just kind of labeling the chart per the rules, circle, square, shade, line, whatever. And it's really just the last bullet point where we actually have to figure something out. So it says, what are the genotypes for each individual? Now remember, the genotypes are, we have an option of either homozygous dominant, heterozygous, or homozygous recessive, right? So we're going to label each of these individuals with those. Now, because it's a recessive trait, we can kind of figure a bunch of them out at one time. So for everyone who is showing the recessive trait, if it's a recessive trait, that means that the trait can only be seen phenotypically on someone if they're homozygous recessive, right? It's a trait that will only be seen when the individual is homozygous recessive. So for everyone who is shaded now, we know the only way they're showing a recessive trait on the outside is if they only have recessive alleles. So everyone who's shaded has to be homozygous recessive. So we can already label, oops, that pin's running out. We can already label everyone who's shaded. It's like half the people, right? We can already label all of those people as homozygous recessive, and now we just have to figure out the other half. And so, kind of similar to the previous example, you can look at each of these and kind of go one by one and say, okay, the only other options then are homozygous dominant or heterozygous. So let's see, for like Jake, for example, we know Jake's partner and all three of Jake's offspring. Now, if we were like, we didn't see all that yet, and we thought, okay, all we know is that Jake could be either this or this. Now that we know the rest of the story, we know that Jake can't be homozygous dominant. Every single one of his children is homozygous recessive, which means they're all getting a little A from mom, which will work, and they're all getting a little A from dad. So dad has to have at least one A. So he has to be heterozygous. Remember, dad's not homozygous recessive. Remember, he would be shaded in if that were the case. So there's only one option. So like I said, you're kind of solving a little problem here. We can do like Anne. Let's do Marissa's family next. So we know Marissa and one of the offspring. So kind of similar for this mystery man over here. Kind of similar to Jake. This one offspring getting a little A from mom, that works. The other little A has to come from dad, and dad can either be only of these two, homozygous dominant or heterozygous, which means if he has to give a little A to their kid, he has to be heterozygous. Like heterozygous for that mystery man. And then now that we know both parents, we can maybe figure out what this individual is. So remember, they're not shaded, so they're not homozygous recessive, so the only option is homozygous dominant or heterozygous. Now, if we thought homozygous dominant, one big A has to come from mom and one big A has to come from dad. Well, they can get a big A from dad, but not from mom, right? So they have to also be heterozygous. And then we can go over here to Anne's family. Let's see if we can figure this one out. There seems to be kind of a little less going on over here, so maybe let's see if it's a little trickier. So we know for both of these individuals, let's look at the offspring first. Sometimes that's a little easier. Offspring. Once again, not shaded in, so we know they're not homozygous recessive. They have to either be homozygous dominant or heterozygous. So if mom has only little A's, she's going to give one of those little A's to her kid, so this kid has to have at least one little A. And the only two options are either no little A's or one little A, or one recessive, right? So that kid has to be heterozygous. And then the only other person we have to figure out is this mystery person over here. Once again, they can be homozygous dominant or heterozygous. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky because this person could actually be either. Now, this can happen sometimes when you have a chart, a pedigree that's a little bigger. Because remember, we could say homozygous dominant. Well, big A is coming from dad, little a is coming from mom. That would work. Or heterozygous. Little a from mom, big A from dad. Both of those would work, right? So that's a little more of a rare scenario. This can happen sometimes. Like if maybe they had another offspring, this would make it a little more clear. So I just want to tell you that every once in a while, sometimes you can have maybe one person. It's not going to be everyone. Don't do a pedigree where like everyone could have been anything. Like it's either going to be 0 or maybe one person kind of on the outskirts of the family that could be like, oh, I'm not quite sure. It's rare, but I just wanted to point out on this one that it can happen sometimes. So keep that in mind. Okay. So now moving on to the next slide. Some general rules about this again. So we have, remember, about dominant versus recessive. So, gosh, do we even really care if you know these ones? Let's see. These are just some guiding principles of like whether they can skip a generation or not, right? So you guys can look at those if you want. And then, moving on to a slightly different topic now. Get ready for a new topic. Let me see how many slides do we have left? Just a couple. Okay, cool. Okay, so now you should be on the side that says race. Now this is important. In anthropology, we do not really typically use the term race, especially when we're referencing like differences between people. Now, in the cultural course, we might have a whole conversation about what does race mean in 2025, race, ethnicity, nationality. There could be an interesting conversation on that end. But in terms of, from the biological standpoint, what we're talking about in terms of the differences between people, we don't use the term race. A couple reasons why, but one of them is because, I get to use my whiteboard again. One of them is because this references kind of an outdated concept called racial typology. Racial typology. Now, racial typology would say, this is why it's a flawed concept we don't use anymore, would say, like, here's one culture, one population. Here's what they look like, here's how they sound, here's the food they eat, here's their religion, here's, XYZ, right? Here's a whole other population. Here's what they eat, here's what they look like, here's their language, here's their religion, here's how they dress, Here's a whole separate and different whole other population or culture. Here's what they look like, here's what they sound like, here's, here's how they dress, here's all these other traits, right? Well, we know this is not how it works, biologically or culturally, right? We are not separate and distinct this way. Whether you're looking at, like I said, biology or culture, it tends to be more of a gradient. And so this would be like, as I'm already erasing, this would be like racial typology would say, we are distinct and different and there's no overlap. We know that's completely absurd, right? Culturally, there's a lot of overlap, but even like biologically, and oftentimes if you look at things geographically, you would see, they actually kind of have a gradation geographically. So what we would see is, here's a group, here's what they look like, here's what they eat, here's their religion, here's their language, etc. Here's another group, a little bit of overlap with what they eat, what they sound like, their religion, what their dress is. Here's another, a little bit more overlap, right? Here's what they look like, here, so on and so forth. So you understand that the idea of race is from this flawed concept of racial typology, which is really kind of incorrect in how it groups, different groups separately, which is totally wrong. However, obviously, in biological anthropology, we understand and can visually see, right, that people look different. Now, this is the term we use for this is actually ancestry, because we were referencing, yes, people clearly look different because of a number of reasons from our, more, distant past, when we were living in more isolated regions of the world where the environments were very different. So, of course, we were adapting to different environments, different foods, different weather, different elevation, different climate, So, of course, we're going to have some physical differences in, body type, height, hair, skin tone, stuff like that, right? We're going to look different, but we're not distinct and separate and different. It's not as if there's one area of the world and they have a medium-toned skin and no other place in the world has medium-toned skin. That's not how it works, right? There's gradation with a lot of these, whether it's a biological trait or a cultural trait. So moving on to the next slide, you can see kind of an example of what I'm talking about. So it's showing, you can see this map of a color, something of color is going from light to medium to dark to medium to light again, right? It's showing here's the physical trait, and here's the geographically how that trait kind of maps onto, like, you know, well, the regions of the world. Hopefully, most of my students usually have seen this one before, but this is just showing skin tone. So the closer you are to the equator, or the more sun exposure or UV radiation you're going to get, the darker your skin tone. This is very This is very adaptive. And then the further away from the sun, the less UV radiation that you're getting, the lighter the skin tone. This is also advantageous. So hopefully that's the perfect segue into, the next slide. Oh, I don't care about that one. That's boring. Okay. Go to the one that says Bergmann's rule. So this is, like I mentioned also before when we talked about like what is science, I said, you know, theory is the overarching explanation, but laws and rules are the little tiny things along the way that when you combine them all together, then you get a theory. So this is an example of that. So Bergmann's rule. So Bergmann's rule is looking at like body type and like weather. There's a couple. Bergmann's rule and Allen's rule kind of go hand in hand. So Bergmann's rule, as you can see with these bullet points, says that in colder climates, the torso, kind of the main trunk of the body, is going to be a bit larger and more robust, right? This is going to aid in heat retention. So obviously if you're living in a very cold environment, you want to have a little bit more of a robust body. So look at all the animals, not even just humans, but animals that live in cold environments. They tend to be a little more round, robust, you know, compact, you know, like that. So like it kind of shows on the slide, you can retain your heat, less surface area, right? So this will be obviously beneficial no matter what type of animal you are. If you're living in a very cold environment, you want to be able to, you know, keep in the heat. Last night we went camping, myself and my partner and our two dogs, and one dog was like in the blankets. She was all like snuggly, and the other dog, I woke up in the middle of the night and I was shivering and she was shivering, and I was like, come here so we can like share our body heat with each other. It was crazy. The other dog was just like a little princess, like she was fine. Okay. The next slide, Allen's rule. So kind of similar to Bergmann's, but just kind of looking at something a little bit different. So for Allen's rule, in climates where it's warmer, your limbs, your arms and your legs will tend to be longer. Basically kind of similar, like I said, to Bergmann's rule, Allen's rule. This allows you to dissipate heat. So these are some very general rules that hold true. But of course, as with literally everything in nature or everything in life, there are going to be exceptions to the rule, right? And this is just one factor. If you're only looking at whether it's hot or whether it's cold, we know environments are much more complex than that, right? So interesting kind of outliers that pop out, like Nordic Europeans, right? So very cold, but they tend to be tall. So their limbs are longer. I think the recent research shows, oh my God, can I talk? The recent research shows that is because of the types of food that they eat. They're eating a lot more like marine resources. So another environmental factor, right? It's never just one. But this rule tends to still be true whether you're looking at humans or other animals. Like a really good example too is like the desert hare. You know, they're very elongated and they're even in their ears and their limbs because they're dissipating the heat, versus you see like snow bunnies, they're very kind of like compact, you know, to retain that heat. Next slide, dark skin adaptation. So we're going to talk about that example I showed a second ago with the skin tone. Why is it beneficial to be dark skin in certain areas of the world? Why is it beneficial to have light skin in certain areas of the world? You know, they're both useful depending on where you are. So you can see here for this dark skin adaptation, this is going to aid in the decrease of UV radiation. Now, nowadays, we talk about this, wear sunscreen. Well, especially in Vegas, right? We're like, wear sunscreen, no one wants to get skin cancer. A lot of people don't realize you can die from skin cancer. In fact, I knew someone who almost died from skin cancer. And then, I don't know if you guys are too young, but there's that show, Grey's Anatomy, where one of the characters famously like had a mole that turned into like brain cancer. Like that can totally happen, right? But it started out as like a skin cancer. So nowadays, though, you'd probably, if you notice something, you'll go to the doctor or an oncologist. Back in the day, if you got skin cancer, it's going to spread. It often will spread to somewhere else, the brain, the heart, something like that, right? So obviously having a trait on your body that will allow you to decrease your chances of having cancer, because remember, this whole discussion is on, are you surviving and thriving and reproducing? Well, you can't reproduce if you die from cancer, right? So any trait that you have that's a benefit to you in terms of decreasing your chances of having cancer obviously is going to be really beneficial. So you're going to, if you have that trait, you're going to be a little less likely to die of something like that, right? So you're going to be more likely than someone who is lighter skinned to survive, thrive, and reproduce and be successful if you are living in an area where their UV exposure is higher, right? You can also see some other examples of what it's useful for. So if you get too much radiation, this can cause to actual like folate breakdown or certain types of anemia, which can cause something called a spontaneous abortion. More the common term would be miscarriage, right? So now we're dealing with something that can directly affect actual reproduction, actually whether you have offspring successfully. So having the ability in a trait like darker toned skin to be able to, you know, decrease your chances of that is going to obviously be super beneficial. So moving on to the next slide, though, kind of the opposite of this is looking at light skin adaptation. Like, why is it beneficial to have light skin in certain areas? So similarly, you're looking at the amount of, you know, sun exposure. Now, most modern humans, like let's say Western civilization, most of us are deficient in vitamin D. And in fact, if you're a female, you should probably starting a supplement already, even in your 20s, of like calcium plus D. It's very important. But most of us don't get enough vitamin D. Usually we get our vitamin D from the sun. That's like the best natural source of it. You can get it in food, of course, but the sun, mostly because we're inside a lot, right? So we're not getting that sun absorption. Plus, like I mentioned, in Vegas, it's like you don't want to be out too long. You don't want to sunburn on your way to your car. Like, I've literally had that happen where my feet got burned just walking through like the university parking lot. Like, it's crazy. That was years ago. Anyway. So if you're in an area where you need to be able to absorb as much of the vitamin D as possible when maybe the sun exposure is low, it's cloudy, it's gloomy, like you're not as close to the equator, having lighter toned skin to absorb as much as you can is going to be beneficial, because without vitamin D, your heart health can be affected, your nervous system health. It helps with the absorption of calcium, so like your bone health and like nervous system. So having enough vitamin D is really important. And you can see at that last bullet point, there's a disease called osteomalacia, or rickets is like the common term. So rickets and osteomalacia is when you don't get enough vitamin D. But like in a severe case, let's say you are a mother who's gestating the fetus, you're not getting any vitamin D. So while that fetus is developing, they're not. And then maybe in their early childhood, again, they're not at all anymore. So basically, to kind of simplify the process of how the body develops, the bones develop, essentially everything kind of starts out as cartilage and then it'll eventually form into bone, and that happens in a very particular process depending on what part of the body, you know, which bone and stuff. And so once an individual is born, an individual human, only part of the skeletal system is in bone. A lot of it's still in cartilage, and the pieces of the bones aren't really fully connected yet, which is why you'll see like babies' limbs look a little like curvy and stuff. It's because or like kind of floppy. It's because they're not fully formed bones yet. It's still a lot of it's cartilage, so it's kind of movable. Now that cartilage will turn into bone, and it'll turn into a bone in a very particular shape. That's all dependent on if you're getting the right nutrients, and if you're not getting enough calcium and vitamin D, it'll just turn into typically not the correct shape. And so you can see here, usually this affects the bones of the legs. You can see on the image on this slide and also on the next slide, like what that would look like. And like I said, in a very severe case. So nowadays you would say, oh, well, that person, even in a severe case, might just have to use a walker or a cane or something. But in the past, right, probably end up not surviving. So keep that in mind. Okay, so that wraps up that one. We're keeping around this 30-minute mark. I think we're doing it for the most part. Okay, I'll see you guys on the next one.